Energy media readers, this is another interview about the $15 billion bailout or support package for the oil and gas industry that's supposed to be coming this week. And to talk about it, I've asked Professor Melanee Thomas, a political scientist from the University of Calgary, to join me today. So welcome to the interview, Melanee.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I have to tell you, I was a little surprised that the Trudeau government was as willing to drag out the big red checkbook for the oil and gas industry as they appear to be. And the reason for that is my working hypothesis is that Premier Jason Kenney and the leaders of the oil and gas industry are really, really bad at politics, national politics, working within the Confederation to get what they want and need. They do it with belligerence and, outright hostility and opposition to the government, which is not the way usually these things are done. Your take on that, please.
So being based in Calgary, as you said that, I can hear howls coming up from not very far away, because people will say, how is it possible to claim that these folks aren't particularly good at politics when they consistently win elections and they happen to be on the top of their game or the top of their fields? And I agree with you. I don't think that the politics that I've seen, particularly from the current government of Alberta, but also from elements of more local oil and gas industry, so contrasting Alberta-based industry to more transnational corporations, like the approach has been very different, particularly on climate policy and pricing carbon. Like that's where we can see lots and lots of differences between folks that are Alberta-based and folks that are major international players. I've described it, particularly coming from the current government of Alberta, as bellicose. And the reason why I think that this approach is being taken is because, for a few things, on the political side of things, if you're in Alberta, one of the things that features Alberta politics is that we don't typically toss the rascals out ever with election, which means that the difficult stage in winning electoral politics comes through an internal party contest, so securing a nomination, securing party leadership, something along those lines. Then engagement with the public and actually having to persuade the public that you're not full of it it's a task that I don't think is often taken particularly seriously, and I really don't think genuine public engagement and open-mindedness to public engagement is a feature of this current government. I mean, this is not new. People who've been following Alberta politics for some time would have seen this as a feature of the Klein campaigns or the Klein government at a certain point. So it's not new, but yeah.
It's not new, but I mean, I was around in Alberta during the Klein years and even actually during a little bit in the Lougheed years. And I get that sometimes Alberta fights with Ottawa. I mean, they're hardly the first province to do that, or the only province to do that. But it's the, as you say, the bellicosity, the pugnacious approach to this. And are there any parallels, any examples in Canadian political history, particularly modern political history, where other governments, other provinces have tried
that? I mean, other provinces have tried walking right up to the brink, say, or walking right up to the line to try to get what they wanted. I know Klein had done something along those lines. I want to look at Quebec, perhaps, to see how the Quebec government has done this, except that you don't get things like the Caisse Populaire, the Quebec pension plan, without some serious negotiations and a position that is persuasive. And I mean, so in order to actually be able to play politics as a power game like that, you have to be able to enter into a negotiation where you want something, but you're also prepared to give or take something that the other party wants. And so when I listen to the Kenney government in particular, all they're doing is, I mean, to me, it seems like it was so much more of a partisan, we just really hate the Trudeau Liberals. So this came up during the federal election campaign with the Premier actually going into Ontario ridings and saying, Justin Trudeau is an existential threat to Alberta. It's a ridiculous argument. He's not. The Trudeau government is not an existential threat to Alberta, but we know from political science research that this idea that certain governments are responsible for regional alienation strongly stratifies on party identification. So when the Harper government was in office, it wasn't Alberta that was the most regionally alienated part of the country. It was Ontario and the Maritimes. And that has to do with party ID, right? So when I look at the negotiations that are happening, it's just screaming coming from Alberta. There isn't the kind of like point, counterpoint, give or take, like even reasonable open-mindedness for any kind of points of negotiation.
So if I'm sitting in Ottawa and I'm listening to what's going on, from Alberta, and and let's say it's not just the Kenney government, industry has been joined at the hip with the Kenney government and has made any number of very, very suspect kind of comments. But here's the thing. With Quebec, they could argue that they were distinct because the language, history, culture, even their legal system is different. With Alberta, it's you didn't give us a pipeline, or you didn't give us enough pipelines, or and therefore we're going to separate, or we're really angry at you, and that just seems to me such a flimsy argument.
It is a terrible argument, in fact. It's not the first time that this comes out of the West. When you've got this kind of regional resentment that comes from Western Canada, it is almost always rooted in arrogance that comes from being the most wealthy. So a really good counterpoint to what we see in Alberta now, and what we've seen, I think, in Alberta over subsequent oil booms in the past decade or so, is a book called The Politics of Resentment, published in 1998 by Dr. Resnick at University of British Columbia, where it's BC talking about resentment. And when his work comes through, and it's very clearly about BC thinking that they're not given the laudatory position that they should be given in the Canadian Federation because they are the most wealthy. And so when they talk about separating, the separating impulse comes from, well, we've got the money to go it alone. So why would we even bother wanting to stay in the Federation, because these loafers are just taking our money and they don't appreciate us. And it certainly sounds really familiar, right? So when I was teaching that book last, it happened to be during the week of the federal election campaign in 2019. And I was like, oh, it's ecclesiastical. Nothing is new under the sun. And this is also one of the reasons why I think this particular argument is not particularly good from the Kenney government again, and also from like local industry particularly local oil and gas. When I say local, I mean Alberta-based smaller operators that are not like the Shells and like the BPs and the folks who have been saying, who are either divesting their oil sands projects or saying, for us, stability is a price on carbon. So could you just get over yourselves and like get the show on the road with this already, right? So when I hear Mr. Kenney speaking in this particular context, I want to fully acknowledge that the price of oil is it is not good. And I don't think that we're going to be getting that boom back again. And I think this is really unsettling and disturbing for folks in Alberta. But the argument seems to be about it literally boils down to, we're still the wealthiest, we want to stay the wealthiest, and we need you to pay us off so we continue to be the wealthiest. It's a terrible argument.
And the final question, Melanee, I think the Saudi-Russia price war is it a wake-up call for industry and the Premier? Because one could argue that if Alberta ever needed Canada, now is the time. And piling on the COVID-19 pandemic on top of all of that just seems to reinforce the argument that Alberta needs a different set of politics so that it can build the support it needs to get the support it requires from the federal government. What do you think of that?
So I think that what the context that we find ourselves in shows forcefully that we needed to have done this differently years ago. For me, the final nail in the coffin was the Saudi IPO, when they were talking about wanting to get initial investment in their own state oil companies, where they said, effectively, nobody can produce oil more cheaply than we can, which means in 2050, the oil is going to come from us. And I'm pretty sure Jason Kenney's aware of this, because he says things like, well, we're more ethical, so the last barrel of oil should come from Alberta. And from an economic perspective, I think it's really clear that the economy doesn't care about those ethics. It's unfortunate that it doesn't, but the idea that we're going to pay triple to produce a barrel of oil from Alberta because ethics, when we could get it from the Saudis for that cheap, while the industry is in its death knell, is ludicrous, to be frank, particularly because a Canadian bank was backing that IPO. So I see this now, and now I'm looking at this and thinking, I don't know what more it's going to take for leadership in Alberta across politics and the economy to like get the memo and hustle to make sure that we're not lagging further behind in terms of where the economy is going than what we already are. The previous government, and somebody's going to make this a complaint about partisanship, but I mean, the previous government seemed to understand that reasonably well. But the previous governments to the previous government also seem to understand that reasonably well. When we ask about this in terms of public opinion, a majority of Albertans always say that they think oil and gas has too much say in provincial politics. Super majorities think that we need to massively expand our access to renewable energy. And people are still like, there's an ideological and identity commitment to oil and gas, and I understand that, and that's not going to go away. And I understand that that identity is driving a lot of the anxiety, and also like people who might be reacting negatively to our comments here. Like, I get that, but the psychology of that is not the economy, right? And so what I see now is a context where we're just getting more and more evidence to suggest that this very privileged status quo for a particular kind of industry and a particular way of doing politics in Alberta is not doing the public any good.
Melanee, thank you for this. Really appreciate it. And no doubt things are going to get worse before they get better. So I look forward to our next chat about this topic.
Right. Have a good day.